The wine glass hit the carpet on purpose. 40 guests were seated inside the Castellano estate that night, and not one of them said a word. Celeste Marchetti had already taken the chair at the head of the table, the one nobody in that family had dared to touch in 60 years, and she was wearing a signet ring to match. She snapped her fingers at the waitress standing against the wall. "On your knees. That's what you're paid for, isn't it?" The waitress was 27. Her name was Zelda Bennett. She earned $11 an hour pouring coffee on the south side of Chicago, and until that morning she hadn't even known whose house she'd be working in. She knelt down on that $1,000 rug and started cleaning. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. And somehow that made the room feel worse. Then Celeste slid the ring off her finger and dropped it into the wine. "Pick it up. Careful, it's worth more than your whole life." Nobody moved. Nobody ever moved in that house, because the man who owned it had a way of making silence feel safer than speaking. And that's exactly when the doors opened. The man who walked in was 38 years old, and there wasn't a person in that room who'd ever seen him raise his voice. He didn't hurry. He crossed the entire dining room, went down on one knee beside the woman on the floor, took her hand, and put his own jacket around her shoulders. Then he stood up, looked at the woman sitting in that chair, and said 7 words that stopped every heart in the room. "Get up. This is my wife." A fork slipped out of somebody's hand, and 40 people who thought they knew exactly who this man was realized they'd never known him at all. If stories about loyalty and dignity mean something to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe, because we've got a new story for you every single week. Now let's go back 7 months, to the rainy March night behind a diner, and find out how a woman on her knees became the most dangerous secret in Chicago. Zelda Bennett pushed open the back door of Ruby's with her hip, both arms wrapped around a heavy black trash bag, and stepped into the rain-flooded alley at 2 o'clock in the morning. The March rain in Bridgeport wasn't heavy, but it cut cold against the skin. The kind of steady drizzle that was enough to soak straight through the worn shoes that had already begun splitting open at the toes. She tossed the trash bag into the dumpster, turned to go back inside, and heard a sound. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't the wind. It was breathing. She stood still for 3 seconds, one hand still resting on the dumpster lid, then took 2 steps forward and looked down. A man was slumped against the brick wall, one leg stretched straight in front of him, one hand pressed hard against his left side. Rainwater ran down his face. Beneath the palm, clamped against his ribs, a dark stain was spreading through his shirt, and Zelda knew immediately what it was because it didn't look like water. His armored car had been ambushed 3 blocks away, forcing him to ditch the vehicle and slide into the shadows alone to lose the shooters. She dropped to her knees on the wet concrete before she had time to think. "Can you hear me?" The man opened his eyes. His gaze was more alert than she'd expected, strangely clear for someone in his condition. "I'm calling an ambulance." She pulled the phone from her apron pocket, and the hand pressed against his side suddenly lifted and caught her wrist. Not hard. He didn't have enough strength left for hard, but his fingers tightened just enough to make her stop. "Don't call the police." 3 words. He forced them out with everything he had left in his chest, then released her wrist, as though even that small effort had drained him. Zelda sat motionless, the phone still glowing in her hand, and in the space of about 3 heartbeats, she understood exactly what she was looking at. An ambulance in Chicago never came alone. If she called 911 for a wound like this, then within 15 minutes, the alley behind the diner would be flooded with red and blue lights, and this man would be taken somewhere he clearly didn't want to go. She looked down at the hand pressed against his ribs. Blood had already soaked all the way to his wrist. She slipped the phone back into her apron. Years later, whenever Zelda thought about that night, she still couldn't explain why she'd done it. She only knew that there was no one else in that alley, and if she walked away, he would die right there beside a dumpster in the rain. She unwound the gray wool scarf from around her neck, folded it in half lengthwise, then folded it once more to make it thick. "Move your hand." He didn't. "If you don't move your hand, I can't stop the bleeding. You choose." His hand came away from his side. Zelda pressed the folded scarf directly over the wound and leaned down with the full weight of her upper body, one hand over the other, elbows straight. She heard him pull a breath through clenched teeth, but he didn't make a sound. "I need you to do one thing for me. Can you stand up?" He nodded, barely. She slid her shoulder beneath his arm, kept her other hand maintaining pressure on the wound, and pushed upward with her legs instead of her back. He was far heavier than she'd expected, and it took them 3 stops to cover the 15 steps from the dumpster to the storage room door. Inside the storage room were a plastic chair, several boxes of coffee beans stacked against the wall, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. She lowered him to the floor with his back against the boxes, then reached for the first aid kit mounted beside the fire extinguisher, the box she'd never once opened in the 2 years she'd worked there. She lifted the lid, glanced inside for 1 second, then took out gloves, gauze, a roll of bandage, and scissors. Nothing else. She pulled on the gloves with one decisive motion. "I'm going to cut your shirt open. I won't stop halfway through, so if you want me to stop, say it now." He said nothing. She cut through the fabric, cleaned around the edges of the wound, placed gauze over it, and pressed down again, then wrapped the bandage around his torso, each turn overlapping 2/3 of the one before it. Her hands moved according to an order she didn't have to think about in order to remember. She checked the pulse at his wrist with 2 fingers, looked at the clock on the wall, counted for 15 seconds, then multiplied by 4 without saying the number aloud. She took her uniform jacket from the hook and laid it over his chest because his skin was colder than it should have been. Then she pulled the plastic chair closer, sat down about 3 feet away from him, and stayed there. He was awake, then drifting, then awake again. Each time his eyes opened, she asked whether he still felt cold, or told him to breathe more slowly. That was all she said. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask who had shot him, or why, or what he did for a living, or why a man wearing a shirt that expensive had been sitting in an alley behind a diner in Bridgeport at 2 o'clock in the morning. At one point, he watched her for a long time, as though he were waiting. The question never came. By 4 o'clock in the morning, his breathing had steadied. Zelda stood, checked the bandage one more time, then went out front and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Because her shift still had 3 hours left, and outside the windows, dawn hadn't come yet. At 7 o'clock that morning, when Zelda went back into the storage room to get a box of sugar, he was already able to sit upright, his back straight, one hand resting on his knee. Her uniform jacket had been folded neatly and placed on top of the stack of coffee boxes, folded into such a perfect square that for a moment she found herself strangely unsettled by it. He looked at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" Zelda set the box of sugar down. "I studied nursing. 2 years." He didn't ask what had happened to those 2 years, and she was grateful for that. He rose slowly, one hand braced against the wall, then reached into the inside pocket of his trousers and pulled out a thick stack of bills folded in half and held together with a thin metal clip. He didn't count it. He simply placed the entire stack on top of the box beside her folded jacket and pushed it toward her. Zelda looked at the money for about 2 seconds. It was thicker than any amount of cash she'd ever held at one time in her life. She reached out and pushed it back toward him, neither quickly nor slowly. "I didn't save you for money. I did it because I was the only person there." He didn't pick the money up right away. He stood there looking at her, and for the first time all night, Zelda saw a clear expression cross his face. The expression of a man who had just encountered something that hadn't existed anywhere in his calculations. Then he picked up the stack of money, slipped it back into his pocket, and gave a single nod. "Do you still have your scarf?" She shook her head, pointing to the blood-stained scarf resting on the corner of the table. Before walking out, he quietly picked it up and folded it into his coat pocket. He nodded again, then walked past her and out through the back door. From the kitchen, Zelda heard a car engine start in the alley and then back out onto Halsted Street. She didn't go to the window to watch. She still had 3 hours left in her shift, and after that she had another shift waiting for her. Ruby's paid her $11 an hour before tips, and $11 an hour was a number Zelda had learned to convert into other units inside her head. 2 hours behind the counter was 1 box of blood pressure medication for her mother. 6 hours was a week's worth of gas, back when she still had a car. She had sold the 2006 Corolla in November for $1,800, and now she took the number 8 bus and transferred to the number 21, a total of 1 hour and 15 minutes each way. Ellen Bennett was 56 years old and underwent dialysis 3 times a week at a center near Mercy Hospital, 4 hours each session, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Medicare covered 80%. The remaining 20%, plus medication, plus the first 3 months before she became eligible, plus 2 hospital admissions for infections in her access line, had accumulated into $41,000 worth of bills sitting inside a shoebox beneath Zelda's bed. She didn't hide that number from her mother. She simply never said it aloud. Ellen was the kind of woman who, if she knew exactly how far behind her daughter was, would skip a dialysis session to save money. And Zelda knew that for certain because she'd already done it once in September, and it had taken Zelda 4 days to find out. Ellen had taught 4th grade at a public school in Bridgeport for 22 years. There were still Saturday mornings when people stopped her on the street to say hello. Men now well into their 30s who still called her Miss Bennett. She remembered every one of their names, Now she sat for 4 hours at a time with a needle in her arm, and still asked Zelda whether the diner had been busy that day, still reminded her daughter to eat breakfast, and every time Zelda took her to the center, Ellen greeted the receptionist by name. That morning, after her first shift ended, Zelda took the bus home, showered, slept for 2 hours, then went to work an afternoon shift at another restaurant on 35th Street. She got home at 11 o'clock that night. Ellen was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper and a pencil, working on a crossword puzzle. "You should buy yourself a new scarf." Zelda stopped in the doorway. "What? Where's your scarf?" "The gray one." Zelda opened the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of water, and turned her back to her mother. "I lost it on the bus." Ellen didn't say anything else. She filled in one square, crossed out another. Then, without looking up, she said, "It's very cold outside, sweetheart." Zelda finished the glass of water. She thought about the man sitting against the stack of coffee boxes, about the way he'd folded her jacket into a perfect square before she came back into the room, and about the stack of money she'd pushed back toward him. For one very brief moment, she wondered whether she'd been stupid. $41,000 sat beneath the bed about 13 feet from where she was standing. Then she washed the glass, turned it upside down on the rack, and didn't think about it again. 3 weeks later, she'd almost forgotten the whole thing. He walked into Ruby's at 10 o'clock one night, near the end of March, and Zelda recognized him before she had even fully lifted her head, because there was something too straight and steady about the way he came through the door for a man who had been shot only 3 weeks earlier. He sat down at the table in the farthest corner, the one with a wall behind his back and a clear view of the entrance. Zelda brought him a menu. He didn't open it. Black coffee. She poured it. He took one sip, set the cup down precisely inside an old water ring on the tabletop, then said, "My name is Adam Rusk." Zelda stood there with the coffee pot still in her hand. 3 weeks earlier, she had decided not to ask his name, and now the name had come to her on its own, and she didn't know what she was supposed to feel about that. "Zelda, I know." He pointed to the name tag pinned to her apron. She couldn't keep herself from smiling, just a quiet little sound, and it was the first time in the 2 times they had met that she had smiled in front of him. "What do you do, Mr. Rusk?" "Logistics. For a transportation company. I oversee warehouses and vehicle schedules." She nodded. She didn't ask which company, and she didn't ask why a man who managed warehouses had been sitting in an alley behind a diner at 2 o'clock in the morning with a bullet hole in his side. He looked at her, and she had the feeling he was waiting for exactly that question, as though he'd been waiting for it for 3 weeks. It still didn't come. He finished his coffee, left $2.65 for the bill, and exactly $2.65 as a tip, not a penny more or less, then walked out. Zelda picked up the money and stared at it for a long time. A 100% tip was something she received maybe twice a year, usually from drunk men close to dawn, and it always came with some remark she had to pretend she hadn't heard. This was different. This felt like someone had calculated very carefully exactly how much she would accept without pushing it back across the table. He came back the following Thursday night, then the Tuesday after that, then twice in 1 week. Always the table in the farthest corner, always black coffee, always around 10 o'clock or later, when only a handful of customers remained, and the music coming from the broken speaker near the ceiling could be heard more clearly than it ever could during the day. He didn't talk much. Zelda gradually realized that he spoke less than any regular customer she had ever served. And yet somehow he knew more than all of them. One evening, she carried a plate of eggs to a man sitting at the counter, and when she came back, Adam said, "The refrigerator downstairs is louder than it was last week." Zelda stopped. "You can hear that from here? It runs in cycles. Once every 4 minutes. Last week it was every 5. She mentioned it to the kitchen manager the next day. 3 days later, the compressor failed, and they lost an entire night's revenue because all the meat had to be thrown away. Another evening, he asked, "Did you switch shifts? How do you know? Last week you left at 11:30. This week you're still here at 12:10. She wiped down the counter without looking at him. "The girl on nights is out on maternity leave. I picked up the extra shifts." He didn't ask why she had taken them. He didn't tell her that it was too many hours for one person, either. He simply registered it, the same way he had registered the refrigerator, and said nothing more. Zelda began noticing small things about him. He never sat with his back to the door. He placed his phone face down on the table, but never turned the screen off completely, and every time it vibrated he only glanced at it once before turning it face down again. On 2 nights, he left the diner in the middle of his coffee after checking the phone, leaving the cup still 2/3 full, and the money exactly equal to the bill. One night, he stayed until she closed, And when Zelda pulled down the metal security gate, she saw him standing at the edge of the parking lot, about 100 feet from the place where she waited for the bus, his back turned toward her, both hands in his pockets. He remained there until the number 8 bus arrived. She climbed aboard. He didn't wave, didn't watch her leave, and only turned away after the bus had already begun moving. Zelda sat down, looked out through the window, and a thought entered her mind that she pushed away almost immediately, that the man named Adam Rusk might have been standing there on all 4 of the previous nights too, and she had simply happened to notice him once. April came, and with it came routine. On the nights when only the 2 of them were left in the diner, Zelda began sitting down. The first time she did it was on a Tuesday night, around 3 o'clock in the morning, after she had finished wiping down the last row of tables, and her legs hurt badly enough that standing for another minute seemed unreasonable. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with her glass of water. He didn't seem surprised. He simply moved his coffee cup aside to make room. They talked about things that didn't matter. About the regular who sat at the counter every morning and had ordered the same meal for 7 years. About the broken speaker in the corner near the ceiling. About the number 21 bus, changing its schedule without warning. Zelda noticed something strange, that she talked far more than he did, and yet she never once felt as though she were talking to herself. He listened in a way she had never encountered in anyone before, not nodding just to be polite, not waiting for his turn to speak, not interrupting with a similar story of his own. He listened, then asked about the exact detail she had thought she'd barely mentioned. 6 weeks passed that way. Then one night, near the end of the month, he asked her a question. "What do you want for yourself?" Zelda was wiping the rim of a glass. Her hand stopped. For a moment she thought she'd heard him wrong, and she opened her mouth to give the answer she always gave everyone, that she wanted her mother to get better, that she wanted to pay off the debt. But he continued, very quietly, "Not for your mother, for you." She sat still. 6 years. She counted backward in her head and arrived at exactly that number. 6 years since the day her mother had received the first test results, and not one person had asked her that question. People asked how her mother was doing. People asked whether Zelda was managing. Some even told her what a good daughter she was, but no one asked what she wanted. "I studied nursing at Malcolm X," she said. "I left halfway through my 2nd year." He didn't ask why. He waited. "That fall, my mother started dialysis. I missed 2 clinicals because I had to take her, then 3 more, and eventually I realized I couldn't work 2 shifts and stay in school at the same time." She turned the glass slowly in her hands. "I still had 3 semesters left. I kept the books. It's stupid, but I kept them." "It's not stupid." He said only those 3 words. And Zelda had to look down at the table for a moment. "I still remember all of it. That night in the storage room, my hands just knew what to do. I didn't have to think." She looked up and found him watching her in a way that made her slightly unsteady. "You think I'm lying?" "No." He turned his coffee cup in a small circle on the tabletop. "I think if it hadn't been you that night, I wouldn't be sitting here now." He had never said that aloud in all 6 weeks, and he said it in the same even voice he had used when talking about the refrigerator. Zelda stood and carried the glass away because she didn't know what to do with her face. On the last night of April, she locked up close to 3:30 in the morning. It wasn't raining. He was waiting at the corner of the parking lot, in the place she had come to recognize as his place. She walked toward him. "You don't have to stand here every night." "I know. Then why do you keep doing it?" He didn't answer right away. Only one of the overhead lights in the parking lot was still working. The other had burned out the month before. "Because the bus stop is about 130 feet from here, and there are no lights." Zelda looked at him. She thought about the stack of money she had pushed back across the box, about the tip that always matched the bill exactly, not a penny more or less, about the way he never asked what she needed, and simply stood quietly somewhere he could see her. She had spent 6 years surrounded by people who needed her to be strong, and he was the first person who behaved as though she didn't have to be strong 24 hours a day. "Adam." "Yeah." She stepped half a pace closer and kissed him. He stood still for 1 heartbeat, just long enough for fear to flash through her that she had misunderstood everything, and then his hand came up to her cheek, and he kissed her back. The number 8 bus pulled into the stop, waited for about 20 seconds, then moved on. Zelda heard it pulling away behind her, and didn't turn around. When they finally drew apart, he said, "I'll drive you home." She nodded. Neither of them spoke during the ride back to Bridgeport, and for the first time in a very long while, Zelda didn't calculate a single number in her head. In the middle of May, he texted her an address in River North, and told her he'd be stuck at work until late. Zelda read the message while she was folding paper takeout boxes, and she thought about how many times over the past 6 weeks He'd had nothing but black coffee for dinner. She packed 2 servings of pasta and a container of soup, asked the kitchen manager if she could leave 20 minutes early, then caught the bus north. The address turned out to be a 4-story red brick office building on a quiet street, the kind of building with no sign, no company name, only a brass street number mounted beside the door. The street-level entrance was slightly open. Zelda thought she'd gotten lucky. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, carrying the bag of still warm food in both hands, and pushed open the only door with light showing beneath it. There were 7 men in the room. 6 were seated around a long table. And the moment the door opened, all 6 of them stood at once. They weren't standing because of her. They stood because of the man who had just stepped through a doorway on the far side of the room. And in the instant they rose, the jackets of 4 of them opened just enough for Zelda to see what they were wearing beneath their arms. She didn't need to know anything about guns to understand that they were guns. On the long table, between coffee cups and paperwork, was a row of portrait photographs laid out side by side. Large photographs, printed on heavy paper, taken secretly out on the street. Beside them was a handwritten list with names crossed out. Zelda stood in the doorway with the bag of food in her hands. The man closest to the door took 1 step sideways, placing himself between her and the table, and lowered his voice. "You've got the wrong floor." He looked about 34, broad-shouldered, and the way he moved told her he'd made that exact move many times before. "Tobias." Just 1 word, from the other side of the room. The man named Tobias stepped back half a pace, but he didn't leave his position. Adam Rusk walked around the end of the table and stopped about 10 feet from Zelda. He said nothing for 2 seconds. Then he reached one hand behind him and, without turning his head, said, "Turn the photographs face down." All 6 men obeyed at the same time. Not one of them asked him to repeat himself. That was the detail that made Zelda understand. Not the guns, not the photographs. It was the way 6 grown men obeyed one short command without a single one of them looking up. She stared at him. "You don't work in logistics." "No." She remained where she was. The bag of food was still warm in her hands, and she could smell the soup through the paper. "What's your name?" "Nolan Castellano." Zelda had heard that last name before. Not in the news, not in any specific story, but in the way a person living in Chicago hears certain family names for years without ever asking too many questions. The kind of name that appeared in stories told by older men at bar counters, and was always followed by a small silence. She took 1 step backward. Her heel touched the doorframe. Nolan didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, and Zelda realized he was deliberately refusing to close the distance between them, like a man who understood that 1 more step right now would ruin everything. "I never lied to you about who I am," he said. "I just didn't tell you what it was called." Zelda looked past his shoulder at the 6 men standing as still as statues, then at the stack of photographs now turned face down on the table. Inside her head, the scattered pieces of the past 6 weeks began fitting together so quickly that she felt dizzy. The bullet wound in his side, those 3 words, "Don't call the police." The fact that he never sat with his back to the door, the way he stood at the corner of the parking lot every night, in the one place where he could see the entire street, even the tip that always matched the bill exactly, down to the last cent, something she had once thought was thoughtful, and now understood as the habit of a man who had spent his entire life making sure he never left anything unusual behind. "I brought this for you," she said. Her voice sounded normal, and somehow that normalness was worse than if she had screamed. She placed the bag of food on the floor right beside her feet without taking a step closer. Then she turned and walked down the stairs. She heard Tobias say something behind her, and then heard Nolan's voice cut him off with a single word. No one followed her. When Zelda reached the sidewalk, she made it about 130 feet before she had to stop and lean against a wall, and she stayed there for a long time beneath the streetlight, both hands wrapped around her elbows, until she was calm enough to walk to the bus stop. For 3 days after that, Zelda didn't answer a single message. He texted her exactly twice. The first was 1 short line asking whether she'd made it home safely, sent at 11:40 that same night. The second came the next morning and contained only 3 words, "I'll wait for you." After that, he didn't text again, and Zelda understood that even his silence was a kind of respect. The respect of a man who knew that sending 1 more message would become pressure. She still went to work all 3 days. On Friday morning, she took her mother to the dialysis center and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. For those 4 hours, she didn't read anything, didn't open her phone, just sat staring at the frosted glass door. When Ellen came out, she looked at her daughter's face for exactly 2 seconds and asked, "Is something wrong?" Zelda said it was nothing. Ellen didn't ask again. But on the bus ride back to Bridgeport, still looking out the window, she said, "When I was 27, I left a man because I thought I knew everything about him. Turned out I knew exactly one thing. Zelda turned toward her. And then what? Then I never asked him about the second thing. 3 days passed. And Zelda slowly realized that what kept her awake wasn't the guns in that room in River North. What kept her from sleeping was that she didn't know what kind of man she was falling in love with. She was old enough to understand that you couldn't love a name. She needed to know what that name had done. And if she didn't ask now, then one day she would wake up at 40 beside a man she had deliberately chosen not to understand. On Saturday night, she sent him a single line. Parking lot. 3 o'clock. He was already standing there when she pulled down the security gate and locked it. She crossed the parking lot, stopped about 6 feet from him, and didn't waste a single word. Have you ever killed anyone? Nolan didn't ask her to repeat the question. He didn't say it was complicated. Didn't tell her she wouldn't understand. Didn't say he'd never had any other choice. He stood beneath the only overhead light, still working in the lot, and answered. Yes. Zelda drew in a breath. How many? 3. She felt her knees soften slightly, but she stayed where she was. Who were they? The first one was when I was 23. He killed my father 3 months earlier, and I knew it for certain. It wasn't something I'd heard from someone else. He paused for a moment. The second and third were 7 years ago. Same night. They came to my grandmother's house while she was asleep. He didn't add a single sentence to make those 3 deaths easier to hear. He didn't explain. Didn't offer circumstances. He didn't apologize either. Zelda realized that if he had apologized to her then, she would have turned around and walked away, because apologizing to her for those things would have been the cheapest thing he could possibly do. Is there anything else? She asked. Yes. Tell me. There are things I ordered other people to do that I didn't do with my own hands. If you're asking whether I'm clean, the answer is no. Zelda stood in silence for a long time. Somewhere behind her, a car passed along Halsted Street, and then the sound disappeared completely. She thought about that rainy night in the storage room, about the way this man had drawn breath through clenched teeth without making a sound when she pressed the scarf into his wound. She thought about the customer who had sat at the corner table for 6 weeks and listened to her talk about the broken speaker near the ceiling as though it were the most important thing in the world. Those 2 men were the same man. She didn't have the right to choose one half and pretend the other half didn't exist. I'm not asking you to leave that life, she said at last. I'm not naive enough to think you can do that just because I ask. And I don't want you promising me things you already know you can't keep. Then what do you want? One thing. She took 1 step forward, and this time, she was the one who closed the distance between them. I spent 2 years learning how to keep people alive. I sit for 4 hours, 3 times every week, beside a machine whose only purpose is to keep my mother alive. I'm not asking what you do inside that building, because I don't have the right to ask. But I won't be able to live with myself if I have to stand there and watch. Nolan looked at her. He didn't answer immediately. He was the kind of man who never spoke a sentence until he had finished calculating what it would cost him. And Zelda stood there waiting for him to finish the calculation. Then he reached out, took her hand, and spoke very slowly, every word clear, in a low voice she had never heard from him before. You will never have to watch me kill another human being. Zelda tightened her hand around his. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say I believe you. She simply stood there a little longer beneath the overhead light, her hand in his, knowing with complete clarity that she had just stepped through a door she would never be able to walk back through again. 9 days after that night in the parking lot, Nolan pulled up in front of Zelda's house at 7 o'clock in the morning and said, "Can you take a day off?" She was already standing on the front steps with a cup of coffee in her hand. I switched shifts. Where are we going? Wisconsin. They headed north on Interstate 94, leaving Chicago while the city was still locked in morning traffic, and a little more than an hour later, they reached Kenosha. Zelda had never crossed the state line before. She spent the entire drive looking out the window at the Mayfields that hadn't yet had time to turn green. And she didn't ask what he intended to do because she had guessed the moment he said the word Wisconsin. The Kenosha County Clerk's office was inside a low government building, with vinyl floors, fluorescent lights, and a row of orange plastic chairs fastened to the wall. A couple younger than they were sat waiting ahead of them, the girl giggling into her boyfriend's shoulder. Nolan took a number. They sat down in 2 of the orange chairs. I haven't asked you yet, he said. Zelda turned toward him. No, you really haven't. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't pull anything from his pocket. He simply turned toward her and looked straight into her eyes in a room that smelled of paper and photocopier toner. And he said, I want you to be my wife. If you say no, I'll drive you home and everything stays exactly the way it is. Zelda looked at him. She thought about the fact that 2 weeks earlier she hadn't even known his real last name. She thought about the 3 deaths he had spoken of beneath the parking lot light, without once trying to make them sound easier than they were. Then she thought, with sudden and perfect clarity, that she was 27 years old and had spent 6 years saying yes to everything life placed on her shoulders. And this was the first time in those 6 years that she was being given the chance to say yes to something she had chosen for herself. Yes, the clerk called their number. She handed them 2 forms clipped to hardboards and a ballpoint pen tied to the counter with a cord. Nolan filled out his form. Zelda glanced over, only by accident, and stopped at the first line. He didn't write Nolan. He wrote Emiliano N. Castellano. Emiliano, my birth name. He kept writing, without looking up. My grandmother chose it. She named me after her father, but my mother didn't like it. So ever since I was a boy, everyone in the family has called me by my middle name. It's been 38 years. I doubt anyone in the family even remembers anymore. He signed at the bottom of the page. On legal documents, I'm still this name. Zelda looked at the signature for another second, then lowered her eyes to fill out her own form, and thought nothing more of it. The clerk took the applications, collected the $40 fee, stamped the papers, then said in the practiced voice of someone who had repeated the same sentence thousands of times, "The state of Wisconsin has a waiting period. The earliest date is 6 days from today. The license remains valid for 30 days. Nolan nodded. Next Tuesday. On the drive home, Zelda fell asleep for a while. The next 6 days passed with a strange slowness. Zelda still worked 2 shifts. She still took her mother to dialysis on Monday and Wednesday. She said nothing to Ellen, and she knew she would pay for that later. But at the time, she couldn't think of any way to begin a conversation like that with her mother. On Tuesday, they drove back to Kenosha. Zelda wore the dark blue dress she had bought 4 years earlier for a funeral. It was the nicest thing she owned. The ceremony room at the county courthouse was small, with a wooden desk and a state flag standing in one corner. The officiating judge was a man in his 60s wearing glasses, and he asked whether they had brought witnesses. They hadn't. He stepped into the hallway and called in 2 people, an office employee and a man who was waiting to handle some vehicle paperwork. The 2 strangers stood at the back of the room and smiled politely. There were no flowers. No one took photographs. There were no rings. And when the judge reached the part about exchanging rings, he paused for half a second and simply moved on as though it happened all the time. Zelda listened to Nolan say, "I do," in the same even voice he used for everything else. And she realized that was precisely why she believed him. People could perform emotion. No one could perform calm. They signed the marriage certificate. The 2 witnesses signed beneath them. The judge shook both their hands, congratulated them, then called in the next couple. The entire thing took 14 minutes. When they reached the courthouse parking lot, Nolan opened the car door for her, then stopped. "I haven't bought you a ring." "I know. I will. There's no hurry." She got into the car. On the drive home, she held the copy of the marriage certificate in her hands for more than an hour, folding it in half and opening it again, and she read the name on the first line one more time, Emiliano N. Castellano. She thought it was a beautiful name, and that it was strange how an entire family could forget the true name of the man who stood at its head. Then she folded the paper, slipped it into her purse, and didn't think about it again for the next 5 months. At the beginning of June, Emmett Ward called Nolan at 7 o'clock in the morning and said only one sentence: "The old lady wants to see you, today." In the 14 years Nolan had stood at the head of the family, Rosalind Castellano had never summoned him back to Lake Forest that way. She usually waited for him to come on his own. He drove north and arrived before 10. The housekeeper opened the door for him without saying a word. Rosalind was sitting in the reading room on the ground floor, 82 years old, her back straight, a cup of cold tea in front of her, and a leather-bound file lying face down on the table. She didn't invite him to sit. "What were you doing in Wisconsin?" Nolan pulled out a chair and sat down. "You had someone following me." "I've had someone following you since you were 23, and that's part of the reason you're still alive." She turned the file over. "My man only knows you went to Kenosha twice in 9 days. He doesn't know what you did there, and I didn't ask." She pushed the file toward him. "I only need you to read this." Nolan didn't open it right away. "What is it?" "You signed it 8 years ago." He opened the file. The first page was a typed agreement, 3 pages long, with no attorney's heading, no seal, only 4 signatures at the bottom of the 3rd page. The first signature was hers. The second belonged to Julian Marchetti. The third belonged to Celeste's father, and the 4th was Nolan's own, signed when he was 30, in handwriting he still recognized. "Do you remember that night?" Rosalind asked. "I remember." "What do you remember?" "I remember burying 2 of my men in the same week. And I remember you sitting in this exact chair telling me to sign it so it would stop." He closed the file. "I didn't read it carefully." "I know you didn't read it carefully. I let you not read it carefully." She lifted the cup of cold tea, then set it down again. That was a truce between two families. People don't sign peace with paper, Emiliano. They sign it with their children. He looked up when she used that name. She was the only person in the world who still called him that. And she only used it when she wanted him to listen closely. For 8 years, Julian Marchetti hasn't touched a single one of our people, hasn't interfered with a single shipment, hasn't bought off one man. Did you ever ask yourself why? Nolan didn't answer. Because your signature is on that paper. She pushed the tea farther away. There is a deadline clause in it. You're 38 years old now. Julian has reminded me twice in the past 6 months. And the second time he didn't ask. He informed me. Nolan set the file down on the table and sat in silence. Inside his head, the scattered pieces of the past 6 months began lining themselves up, and he didn't like the shape they made. I already have someone, he said. Rosalind gave the smallest nod, as though she had known for a long time and had only been waiting for him to say it aloud. What does she do? She's a waitress. In Bridgeport. Rosalind was silent long enough for him to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Then she spoke slowly, without raising her voice even slightly. Listen to me, and I'm only going to say this once. If you break this engagement to marry a waitress, Julian Marchetti won't see it as a matter of the heart. He'll see it as a declaration of war, and the first person to die won't be you. Nolan didn't take his eyes off her. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you something I've seen 3 times in my life, and all 3 times I was the one who went to the funeral. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what happens. She stood, one hand braced on the arm of the chair, slower than she wanted to be. You are the head of this family. You don't have the right to choose only what you want. Your father didn't either. Neither did your grandfather. At that moment, the sound of heels came from the hallway, and the reading room door opened. The woman who entered didn't knock. She was 29, her hair pinned up, and she walked into that room with the ease of someone who had been there many times before. I'm early, she said to Rosalind, then turned toward Nolan and smiled. Nolan, it's been a long time. Nolan stood. Celeste, my father told me to stop by and say hello to your grandmother, and I wanted to look at the large dining room again. She walked toward the window, glanced toward the hallway leading to the dining room, and said in the same light voice, I think that table is positioned wrong. The head chair should face the main entrance. The person sitting there ought to be the first person the guests see when they walk in. Rosalind said nothing. Nolan looked at Celeste for another second, then picked up his coat from the back of the chair. I have to go, Emiliano. His grandmother called after him when he had already reached the doorway. He stopped, but didn't turn around. I didn't ask what you did in Kenosha, Rosalind said. And don't tell me. There are some things I'd rather not know than have to lie for you. Nolan stepped into the hallway. Behind him, he heard Celeste's voice in the reading room asking Rosalind how many guests would be coming to the family gathering in October that year. Grant Sylvan waited for Celeste in the parking lot of a hotel near the airport on a July afternoon, and he handed her a brown paper envelope through the car window without getting out. 45 years old, chief accountant for the Castellano organization for 11 years, and the only person besides Emmett Ward who was allowed to open the books for the entire family. Inside the envelope were 7 photographs. 6 had been taken from a distance, poor quality images of a parking lot at night beneath harsh overhead lights. The 7th was clearer than the rest. In that one, a man was standing and waiting, while a woman wearing an apron crossed the parking lot toward him. What's her name? Celeste asked. Zelda Bennett, 27 years old, works at Ruby's in Bridgeport, night shift. Sylvan kept his eyes straight ahead through the windshield. 6 nights a week. Celeste stacked the 7 photographs into a perfectly even pile and slipped them into her handbag. How long? Since spring. She didn't ask another question. 3 days later, at 11 o'clock on Thursday night, a car stopped directly outside Ruby's and Celeste Marchetti walked in. There were 3 customers in the diner at the time, and the kitchen manager had gone home at 10. She walked straight to the table in the farthest corner, the one with the wall behind it, and sat in the exact chair Nolan always used. Zelda brought over a menu. I'm not eating. Celeste placed her handbag on the chair beside her. Sit down. Zelda remained standing. I'm working. I know you're working. $11 an hour, right? With tips, your best month comes to about $2,200. She took out her phone and placed it on the table with the screen facing up. And Zelda could clearly see the red circle glowing there as the seconds continued counting upward. I like things to be clear. Say whatever you want to say. I'm recording all of it. Zelda looked at the red circle for 1 second, then pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She placed both hands in her lap. Who are you? Celeste Marchetti. I'm Nolan Castellano's fiancé. She let the sentence sit between them for a while as she watched Zelda's face, and Zelda knew she was being studied. so she refused to let her expression do anything at all. The two families made the agreement 8 years ago. It's in writing. Rosalind signed it, my father signed it, and he signed it. Celeste opened her handbag, took out a check folded in half, unfolded it, and pushed it across the table with 2 fingers. $100,000. Zelda looked down at the check. The number was there, handwritten and unmistakable. $41,000 in medical debt, a full year of dialysis expenses, the 3 semesters she still had left. In 3 seconds, her mind completed every one of those calculations, even though she didn't want it to. She hated herself for that. You quit your job, leave Chicago, and never contact him again. Celeste said, I'm not asking you to say anything bad about him. I'm not asking you to do anything. You just disappear. Zelda didn't touch the check. Do you know what my mother did for a living? Celeste frowned slightly. No. She taught 4th grade for 22 years at a school, 4 blocks from here. Zelda said it plainly, without raising her voice. I'm telling you that because you just told me you know how much I make an hour. You know the number. You don't know anything else. Celeste leaned back in her chair. You think I'm looking down on you? I think you're paying for something you believe can be bought. And I think you already calculated that I'd take it. Everything can be bought. The only difference is the price. Celeste rested one elbow on the table. Listen, I'm not angry with you. You work nights at a diner on Halsted Street. One day, a decent man sits down at your table, and you think your life is about to change. Anyone in your position would think the same thing, but you don't understand what you're standing in the middle of. She pushed the check another inch toward Zelda. He isn't going to leave his family for you. Men like him don't leave. If you take this, you walk away from this with $100,000. If you don't, you walk away with nothing. Both roads lead out. Zelda looked down at the check one last time. Then she placed one finger on it and pushed it back slowly across the entire width of the table until it touched the phone that was still recording. She didn't say a single word. Celeste looked at the check, then at Zelda's finger as it withdrew. Then she picked up the check, folded it in half, and slipped it back into her handbag. She stopped the recording. Do you know what bothers me most? Celeste said, and her voice had changed now. Lower, no longer gentle. It isn't who he sleeps with. I grew up in my family. I know what men are like. It's the way you're sitting there pretending you're above money. She stood, lifted the bag onto her shoulder. You just turned down $100,000, so you're going to lose more than that. She walked out without looking back. The car outside started, then disappeared down the street. Zelda remained sitting at the corner table for a long while, both hands still resting in her lap. Then she stood, wiped down the table, and returned the menu to its place. At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 19th, a pickup truck drove straight into the front of Ruby's, crashed through the large glass windows, and came to a stop in the middle of 3 rows of tables. No one was inside the diner. Ruby's closed at 3 o'clock on Monday nights, and the driver had known that. He fled before the police arrived. It was Celeste's calculated warning shot, a deliberate move to destroy Zelda's livelihood and terrify her into fleeing Chicago without leaving blood on the Marchetti hands. Zelda got a call from the owner at 6 o'clock that morning and took 2 buses to get there. She stood across the street watching 2 workers put up sheets of plywood over the opening where the glass wall had once been. The owner, a man of 64, stood beside her and said the insurance claim would take at least 3 months, that he couldn't afford to keep paying wages while the diner was closed, that he was sorry. He said he was sorry 3 times. Zelda told him not to worry and that she would be fine. She said it in her normal voice, and he believed her. She walked 2 blocks before sitting down on a set of steps. She ran the numbers again in her head. Her afternoon job at the restaurant on 35th Street only gave her 4 shifts a week, 22 hours in total, and that wasn't enough to cover her mother's medication, much less anything else. She sat on those steps for about 10 minutes, then stood and applied for jobs at 3 other places that same morning. Nolan came the following evening. He didn't text first. He parked some distance from her front door and waited outside, and the moment Zelda came out, she knew something was different, because he wasn't standing where he could see the entire street. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, his arms hanging straight at his sides. Come inside and talk, she said. There's no need. She stopped. Nolan, I'm going to get engaged to Celeste Marchetti. Next month. Zelda stood still. At the end of the street, a garbage truck was backing up, its warning beeps sounding at steady intervals. It was arranged 8 years ago, he continued. The 2 families signed an agreement. I have an obligation to my family, and that obligation came before you. I know about the engagement. She came to the diner to see me. She brought a check. I know. Zelda looked up. You knew and you didn't say anything to me. No. He said the word in the same flat voice she had trusted for 5 months, and this time that very flatness made her feel cold. "Nolan, look at me." He looked at her. "That night in the storage room," he said, "you saved my life. I offered you money and you wouldn't take it. From that moment on, I owed you a debt, and I don't like owing anyone." He paused. "I paid it. The last 6 months were me paying it back." Zelda said nothing. "Kenosha too. You needed something more certain than a promise, so I gave you that. Now the debt is settled." "You're saying I was a debt?" "I'm saying everything has a price, and I've finished paying mine." Zelda felt something inside her chest begin to fall very slowly, with terrible order, like a building being demolished from the inside. She thought about the question he had asked her at the corner table, the question no one had asked her in 6 years. She thought about the words, "It's not stupid." She thought about the way he had stood at the edge of the parking lot every night, simply because the bus stop had no light. And she thought about how precisely a man would have to calculate in order to build all of that merely to repay a debt. Something in that calculation didn't fit. No one repaid a debt by asking another person what she wanted for herself. But she was standing on the sidewalk in front of her own house. She had just lost one of her jobs, and she didn't have the strength to go looking for the part that didn't fit. "Then stay away from me and leave that paper locked in your wallet," she said. Nolan didn't answer. "Did you hear me? On paper, I'm still your wife. If you want to protect your family's peace, you better hope nobody finds out." He still said nothing. Zelda waited. She waited long enough to understand that he wasn't going to say anything, and she had been wrong to think his silence meant he simply couldn't be bothered to answer. "Don't come here again," she said. "All right, and don't stand in that parking lot anymore. The diner is closed anyway." He gave one nod, and that was the last gesture he made in front of her for the next 2 months. Then he turned, walked back to his car, opened the door, and got in. Zelda remained standing on the sidewalk until the car disappeared, because she wanted him to see that she was standing straight. Inside the car, Nolan didn't start the engine right away. He placed both hands on the steering wheel and sat there. Then his fingers tightened until his knuckles turned white, and he held them that way for 15 seconds before letting go and driving away. 3 weeks later, Emmett Ward placed a prepared set of divorce papers on his desk, with no plaintiff's name filled in, waiting only to be completed and signed. Nolan looked at the papers, then opened the bottom drawer, placed them inside, and shut it again. Emmett looked at the drawer, then at Nolan, and didn't ask a single question. Throughout the remaining 2 months of that summer, no divorce filing bearing the name Emiliano N. Castellano was submitted to any court in Illinois or Wisconsin, and no one in either family knew that one was supposed to exist. Ellen Bennett died in the early hours of September 6th at Mercy Hospital, 3 days after she was admitted with an infection that, this time, her body no longer had the strength to fight off. Zelda was beside her. The night before, Ellen was still conscious, and she asked her daughter only one question. "That man you never told me about, was he kind to you?" Zelda held her mother's hand. "Yes." "Then that's good." Ellen closed her eyes. "That's all I needed to know." She didn't say anything else. Zelda sat beside the bed until morning, and when it was over, she was the one who folded the blanket herself. She did it in the exact order she had learned at Malcolm X 6 years earlier, and her hands didn't shake. She signed the paperwork on the first floor. Someone handed her a plastic bag containing her mother's personal belongings, and she carried it in her hands all the way home. She called the funeral home on 31st Street. She asked the price, and they told her the cheapest package was $4,200, and she said yes, and she signed an 18-month payment agreement right there. The funeral was held on Tuesday morning at Mount Olivet Cemetery, southwest of the city. The weather was dry that day. 11 people came. Zelda counted them, not intentionally, but she counted. 3 former neighbors, 2 retired teachers who had taught at the same school as her mother, a woman from the dialysis center who had taken half a day off to come, a married couple Zelda didn't recognize, and the man introduced himself by saying he had been in Miss Bennett's 4th grade class in 1993, and he cried more than anyone else there. He said Miss Bennett had been the first person who ever told him he had beautiful handwriting. The owner of Ruby's came too, standing in the back with his hat in his hands. The pastor spoke for 9 minutes. He spoke about a woman who had taught for 22 years at the same school, and he said her name 3 times. And Zelda stood there listening to that name carry through the September morning, and thought that this was the last time anyone would ever say her mother's name aloud in a public place. She didn't cry during those 9 minutes. She stood in the front row with both hands clasped in front of her stomach, and she held herself that way because she knew that if she changed position, she wouldn't be able to hold herself together anymore. When they lowered the casket, One of the two retired teachers stepped forward and took hold of her elbow. Zelda let her. She thanked every person who came to shake her hand. And she remembered the names of 9 of the 11 people there. About 650 feet away, at the far end of the narrow road leading toward the gate, a black SUV was parked beneath a row of maple trees. It had been there before the service began. No one got out. It remained in the same place for 40 minutes, and when the last mourners left the grave, it backed up, turned around, and drove toward the north gate. Zelda never saw it. She stayed another 15 minutes after everyone else had gone. 2 groundskeepers stood some distance away waiting, and one of them asked whether she needed more time. She thanked him and said no. Then she walked to the bus stop on Cermak Road and waited 20 minutes in the sun. When she got home, she sat down at the kitchen table in the exact chair where her mother used to sit and work crossword puzzles. The newspaper from the previous Friday was still on the table, folded into quarters, with a pencil lying across it. The crossword was unfinished. 7 squares were still blank. Zelda picked up the pencil and sat there for a long time. She looked at those 7 empty squares and didn't fill in a single one. Then she set the pencil back exactly where it had been, folded the newspaper, and left it on the table. She stood and went to wash her face. In the mirror, she saw a 27-year-old woman who had just buried her mother, had just lost her job, owed $41,000 in medical bills, and another $4,200 for the funeral, and no longer had a single person in the world she could call at 2 o'clock in the morning. She stood there until the cold water made both her hands numb. Then she dried her face, went back into the kitchen, and reheated the pot of soup left over from Saturday because she knew she had to eat something. That evening, when she passed her mother's room, she noticed a small notebook on the bedside table. Inside was a list of names written in neat teacher's handwriting, arranged by school year. Hundreds of names. Zelda sat down on the floor and turned through the pages one by one. She reached the final page with writing on it. There, beneath the last line, her mother had added one more name in pencil, and that name was hers. Zelda closed the notebook, pressed it against her chest, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark room. She didn't make a sound. Her shoulders shook once, then once again, and she held the notebook tighter, and she stayed there like that until the sky beyond the window had gone completely dark. On October 3rd, Zelda went to the billing office at Mercy Hospital to ask for an extension on her debt. She had prepared everything in advance and placed it inside an envelope. Her pay stubs from the previous 3 months, her mother's death certificate, the payment agreement from the funeral home. She had even practiced at home what she intended to say. That she was unemployed. That she was asking to pay $150 a month. That she wasn't going to disappear. The employee behind the glass counter was a middle-aged woman wearing reading glasses. She took the account number, typed it into the computer, then looked up. "Miss Bennett, there is no remaining balance on this account." Zelda thought she'd heard her wrong. $41,320. Paid in full. September 29th. The woman turned the screen slightly so she could read it more clearly. Wire transfer. 1 payment. Who paid it? The system only says payment by a third party. There's no name. She pressed a few more keys. "I can't access that information either, Miss Bennett. The person who paid requested anonymity." Zelda stood there holding the envelope. "So I don't owe anything anymore." "No, you don't owe this hospital anything anymore." Zelda thanked her twice, and she couldn't remember saying it the second time. She left the billing office, walked the length of the hallway, and sat down on a row of plastic chairs near the elevators. She stayed there for 40 minutes. People moved back and forth in front of her, pushing wheelchairs and medication carts, while she remained where she was with the envelope resting in her lap. $41,000. She thought about Celeste Marchetti and the $100,000 check, but dismissed the thought immediately, because Celeste was the kind of person who would have made certain Zelda knew exactly who had paid. Whoever had done this didn't want her to know, and that was the part that kept her sitting there for 40 minutes. She thought about that night on the sidewalk. He had said the debt was settled. He had said everything had a price, and he'd finished paying his. If that were really true, then why was there still September 29th? People didn't keep paying after they'd declared a debt settled. They only did that when they'd never considered it a debt in the first place. Zelda bent forward, elbows resting on her knees. For the past 6 weeks, she had put that entire story away inside a drawer with a clear label on it, and now something had fallen out of that drawer and was lying exposed on the floor. She had no way to prove anything. She wasn't going to call him either. But when she finally stood and walked toward the bus stop, she carried a question with her that she wouldn't be able to put down in the days that followed. She found work in the middle of October. A catering company on the north side called her after she had applied at 4 different places. The coordinator said they needed someone with table service experience for a private dinner of about 40 guests, and that the pay was $40 an hour for a 6-hour shift. Zelda asked her to repeat the number. The woman did. $40 an hour. It was nearly 4 times what Zelda had ever earned before, and inside her head that number immediately transformed itself into 2 months of funeral home payments earned in a single evening. She calculated it once more before answering. Then she asked where the dinner would be held. The coordinator read out an address in Lake Forest and said the client required all staff to sign confidentiality agreements, keep their phones put away, and not speak to guests unless spoken to first. Zelda said she agreed. She didn't ask the name of the homeowner, because in her line of work no one asked who owned the house. What she didn't know was that 2 weeks earlier, when the company had submitted its proposed staffing list, someone had gone through that list, crossed out 2 names, and added another in ink, along with instructions that this particular person had to be assigned to the main service team in the large dining room, and that if the company couldn't arrange it, the contract would be given to someone else. The coordinator didn't question it. A client paying 4 times the normal rate had the right to choose the staff. That same week, about 186 miles east of Chicago, Nolan Castellano was in Detroit handling a matter involving 2 warehouses along the river. His flight back to O'Hare was booked for 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the dinner, giving him enough time to go home, change, and reach Lake Forest before 7. That morning, Detroit Airport delayed every flight because of fog, and he sent Emmett Ward a single line, 2 hours late, start without me. Emmett read the message at 11 o'clock that morning. He had been at the estate since early morning reviewing the guest list and seating plan, and he had glanced over the service staff roster exactly once, quickly, the same way he had reviewed every such list for 26 years. There were 40 guests, 14 service employees, and not a single name on that list made him stop. At 7 o'clock that evening, Zelda Bennett walked through the back entrance of a house in Lake Forest, wearing the uniform provided by the catering company, picked up a tray, and entered the large dining room without the slightest idea whose home she was standing in. The 40 people in that room reacted in 40 different ways, but every reaction began with the same thing. No one dared to breathe. One uncle, seated halfway down the table, turned to look at his wife as though he needed confirmation that he had heard correctly. 2 people at the far end lowered their eyes to their plates. An elderly aunt lifted one hand toward her mouth, then immediately lowered it again, because she suddenly remembered where she was. At the opposite end of the table, Emmett Ward set down his glass, and he was the only person in the room whose movement was decisive. He didn't look surprised, and several people sitting nearby noticed that. Nolan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a sheet of paper folded in half, and placed it on the table in front of Celeste. He didn't push it toward her. He simply set it down and removed his hand. Read it. Celeste didn't touch it. What kind of game are you playing? Read it. She stared at the paper for about 3 seconds, then opened it with 2 fingers, glanced over it, and gave a very short laugh that barely made a sound. This is fake. She raised her voice so the entire table could hear. You can print something like this anywhere. Anyone could make this in 2 hours. She lifted her head and looked around the table, searching for faces that would nod in agreement, and she found several. Nolan, I don't know what's happening to you, but you can't stand in the middle of your own house, hold up a photocopy, and expect the entire family to believe it. Nolan didn't answer her. He looked toward Emmett Ward. Emmett, the 57-year-old man, rose from his chair. He wasn't carrying anything, and that made several people at the table lift their heads slightly, because Emmett Ward had never said anything important without documents in his hands. 7 weeks ago, Nolan told me to go to Kenosha, he said. I went to the county clerk's office during business hours, requested a certified copy, and checked it against the original register. He paused. The paper on that table is a copy. The certified one is in the safe at my house. Celeste put the paper down. You work for him. You can say whatever he wants you to say. Miss Marchetti, you can go yourself. Kenosha County opens at 8 o'clock Monday morning. Marriage records are public records in the state of Wisconsin. He looked directly at her. Go ahead and search. But you won't find it if you search under the name you're thinking of right now. Silence fell over the room. What is that supposed to mean? One of the uncles seated halfway down the table asked, and his voice belonged to a man who had begun to feel afraid. Emmett turned toward the entire table. It means that in the official registry, this marriage record does not list the name Nolan Castellano. He paused. It lists Emiliano N. Castellano. Of the 40 people seated around that table, only one reacted. At the head of the table, Rosalind Castellano placed both hands flat against the wood. She didn't cry out. She didn't say a word. But she slowly raised her head, and her eyes moved from Emmett to her grandson, and something inside that look seemed to break open after 82 years. She was the one who had given him that name. She was the one who had written it on his birth certificate at the hospital 38 years earlier, naming him after her father, a tailor who had died in Cicero when she was only 17, and she was the only person in that room who still remembered it. Her husband was dead. Her son was dead. There was no one else. Everyone else merely looked at one another. The name meant nothing to them, and it never had. That was precisely why it had worked. For the past 8 years, Emmett continued, his voice still even, every background check on him has been conducted under the name Nolan. Banks, attorneys, and people outside this family. That other name doesn't appear on anyone's list. Celeste placed both hands on the arms of her chair and straightened her back. She understood before the others did, and Nolan saw the exact moment she understood. May 19th, he said. Kenosha County Courthouse. There were 2 witnesses, an office employee and a man waiting to handle vehicle paperwork. Their names are in the record. He looked around the table once, slowly, face by face, and he didn't miss a single person. No one could hold his gaze for more than a second. "You've all been sitting here for 40 minutes, he said. Not one of you stood up. There wasn't a sound. She has been the wife of the head of this family for 5 months. You simply didn't know it." Zelda remained where she was and didn't say a word. She looked at the paper on the table, the same kind of document she had held in her hands for more than an hour on the drive back from Wisconsin, and she realized that this was a copy, not hers. Her copy was still inside her wallet, tucked into the small zippered compartment in the staff changing room behind the kitchen, about 100 feet from where she was standing. The entire room turned toward the head of the table. No one said it aloud, but all 40 people were waiting for the same thing. Rosalind Castellano was the keeper of the laws of this family. She was the one who had signed the agreement 8 years earlier. If she spoke against this, everything would end right there, because in the Castellano family, no one argued with her, not even the man at its head. Celeste understood that better than anyone else in the room. She turned fully toward the old woman and said, her voice recovering its calm, "Grandmother, say something. You signed it. My father signed it. Both families knew." Rosalind pushed her chair back. She rose slowly. One hand braced against the table, and no one dared help her, because no one had ever been permitted to help her. Then she began walking around the long table. She passed behind each person without looking at anyone, and the sound of her heels against the wooden floor was the only sound in the room. It took her nearly a full minute to make it halfway around the table, and during that minute no one dared touch a glass. She stopped behind Celeste's chair. "Give me your hand." Celeste hesitated, then held out her right hand. Rosalind took it, raised it, turned it slightly beneath the light, and studied the signet ring on Celeste's ring finger for about 3 seconds. Then she released Celeste's hand as though letting go of something not worth keeping. "Where did you have it made?" Celeste didn't answer. "I asked where you had it made. At a place on Wabash Street." Her voice had become noticeably quieter. "That's what I thought. They did a fairly good job." Rosalind turned toward the entire table and spoke louder now, clearly enough that no one could pretend not to have heard. "There is only one signet ring in this family. One. It was made in 1929, and there are 3 initials engraved inside it that aren't the letter C." She looked at Celeste. "That ring is on my hand. I've worn it since before you were born. The one you're wearing is something you ordered for yourself. You walked into my house wearing it tonight, and sat down in that chair, and of the 40 people sitting here, not one of them asked you a single question. No one spoke." Rosalind continued walking. She completed the circle around the table, and stopped where Zelda was standing, about 3 feet away, and looked the young woman over from head to toe, without trying to hide it. "What's your name?" "Zelda Bennett." "Bennett." She nodded. "What did your mother do?" "She taught 4th grade, for 22 years. She died last month." Rosalind was silent for a long moment. She looked down at Zelda's hands, then back up at her face. Then she turned toward the dining table and spoke. Not loudly, but not one person missed a word. "My father was a tailor, in Cicero, on 22nd Street. He mended clothes for the men of this family for 11 years, and they paid him at the end of the month if they remembered." She rested one hand against the back of the nearest chair. "I was 19 when I married into this house. I knew no one. For the first 2 years, I wasn't allowed to sit at this table. My mother-in-law told me to eat downstairs in the kitchen with the servants, because she said a tailor's daughter didn't yet know how to hold a knife and fork properly." She paused. "I ate in the kitchen for 2 years. Not one person in this family defended me, not even my husband. Then she died, and I sat in her chair. And 63 years have passed since that day." No one in the room moved. The server standing near the kitchen door was as still as everyone else. An older woman seated near the far end of the table lifted her napkin to her eyes. "I've never told that story to anyone," Rosalind said. Not even my son. Not even this boy. She raised her hand and removed the ring from her finger. She had to twist it twice before it came free because she had worn it continuously for 63 years, and her knuckles were no longer what they once had been. Then she took Zelda's hand, turned the palm upward, and placed the ring in the center of it. The chair doesn't make the lady of the family, she said. The night you bandaged this boy without asking who he was, you already were. She closed Zelda's fingers around the ring and held that clenched hand between both of hers for another moment. Zelda stood there with her hand closed tight, still unable to say a word. Rosalind turned and looked around the table one final time. Anyone sitting in this house tonight who thinks what just happened was normal shouldn't call me tomorrow morning. No one answered her. Then she returned to her place. She sat down, pulled her chair in, and reached for her glass of water as though she had simply finished another task in the course of her day. Celeste remained seated in the chair at the head of the table. No one looked at her anymore. That was the worst part. She lowered one hand, removed her own ring, and closed it inside her palm. At the far end of the room, a man rose from his chair, walked into the hallway, and took out his phone to call someone. Nolan watched his back until he disappeared beyond the doorway. Emmett Ward stepped into the hallway and returned less than 2 minutes later, and this time he was carrying a file. Nolan, I was going to give you this tomorrow morning. He placed the file on the table without opening it. For the past 3 weeks, I've been reviewing every cash flow entry in the logistics division. There are 11 transfers to a company in Indiana I've never heard of. I traced them all the way through. He turned to the second page and rotated the file toward Nolan. On that page was a table with 11 lines, each one showing a date and an amount. The true owner of that company is Julian Marchetti's brother-in-law. 11 transfers over 14 months. More than $2,400,000 in total. Someone halfway down the table drew in a breath. The person who approved all 11 transfers, Emmett said, was Grant Sylvan. Sylvan is waiting outside right now with 2 federal agents. Emmett added quietly. He won't be returning to his desk tomorrow. Nolan didn't look at the file. He didn't ask a single question or ask anyone to explain further. He looked at Celeste. He stood there for about 3 seconds, and during those 3 seconds his expression didn't change, but something in the room changed completely, almost like the temperature had dropped. 14 months, he said. That means it started last summer. He turned toward Emmett. Did anyone know I was in Bridgeport that night in March? Emmett raised his head very slowly. Your schedule for that night was in the internal system. Who had access to that system? 4 people. Me, you, Tobias, and Sylvan. Emmett placed one hand on the edge of the table. Sylvan opened it at 4 o'clock that afternoon. I have the access log. Nolan gave one nod. Then he said the sentence everyone in that room would remember for a very long time. Then I've misunderstood everything for 8 years. This engagement was never about peace. He paid one of my people to know where I was. He sent someone to shoot me in Bridgeport in March. And if I'd died that night, his daughter would have married whoever succeeded me, and the Marchetti family would have swallowed both sides within a year. No one said a word. Nolan looked at Celeste. You knew about March. Celeste didn't answer. She didn't look down, and she didn't deny it. And that silence, lasting exactly 4 seconds in front of 40 people, convicted her more clearly than any testimony ever could. I didn't know beforehand, she finally said. I swear I didn't know beforehand. I found out afterward. How long afterward? 3 days. She lifted her head, and her voice hardened. I'm 29 years old, and I was born for one purpose: to sit in that chair. You think I ever had a choice? Nolan didn't answer. He picked up the file and turned through several pages, slowly, as though he were truly reading them. Emmett stepped closer and lowered his voice, but in a room that's silent, lowering his voice made no difference. Nolan, this can bring down the Marchetti family, but you need to understand one thing. He pointed to the file. These are shared books, 14 years of them. They can bring the Marchettis down, but they'll bring us down too. Nolan closed the file and tucked it beneath his arm. I know. At that moment, the man who had gone into the hallway to make a phone call came back into the room, and he moved quickly toward the front door, instead of returning to his seat. 2 others stood with him, then 3 more. Chairs scraped across the wooden floor all around the table. Handbags were gathered. Someone called for a driver. 40 people had just witnessed something none of them had wanted to be present for, and now every one of them wanted to get out of that house as quickly as possible. Not one of them passed close to where Zelda was standing. Nolan turned to find Zelda. Tobias Kane was already beside her. Take her out through the kitchen door, Nolan said. The car is parked in back. Take Deer Path. Don't use the main gate. Tobias nodded and had already taken half a step when Zelda looked at Nolan. It was the first time all evening that the 2 of them had looked directly at one another, and she was about to say something, but Tobias placed a hand on her elbow. "Miss Bennett, we need to go." She went. She managed to look back once from the doorway leading down toward the kitchen, and she saw Nolan still standing in the same place in the middle of the room as it emptied around him. Rosalind was still seated at the head of the table, motionless, both hands resting on the wood, and she didn't look after a single person who was leaving. 3 minutes later, when only 5 people remained in the room, Nolan's phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. Area code 773. He picked it up. Emiliano. Julian Marchetti was 61 years old, and his voice sounded like that of a man sitting in a very quiet room. "I've just heard an interesting story about dinner at your house." Nolan said nothing. "My daughter just called me. She was crying. I don't like hearing my daughter cry." Julian paused. "You know, I've had men stationed at the Deer Path exit since 7 o'clock tonight. I thought I wouldn't need them." Nolan turned his head toward the kitchen door. It had been closed for 4 minutes. "The warehouse in South Deering," Julian said. "You know the place. You rented it 5 years ago." He paused. "You have 40 minutes. Nolan reached South Deering in 31 minutes. He parked in the empty yard in front of the warehouse, left the headlights on, and stepped out with both hands empty. He wasn't carrying a gun. He had left his own in a drawer at Lake Forest before leaving the house, and Emmett Ward had stood there watching him do it without being able to say a word. There were 4 people inside the warehouse. Julian Marchetti sat in an old office chair, placed in the middle of the concrete floor, one leg crossed over the other, and Zelda sat about 16 feet away from him on a plastic chair, both hands resting in her lap, not tied. She watched Nolan walk in, and didn't make a sound. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, long enough to make sure she was unharmed, then looked away. Julian spread his hands. "You're early. Let her go. She's not being held. She walked in here on her own 2 feet. Julian looked at Zelda, then back at Nolan. "I only invited her somewhere quiet so we could talk. You know me, Emiliano. I don't like noise." Nolan walked to the middle of the warehouse, stopped about 10 feet from Julian's chair, and placed a stiff document envelope on the metal table standing there. "Open it." Julian looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "What's this?" 14 years of books, from both families. Nolan stood straight, his arms resting at his sides. 11 transfers to your brother-in-law's company. Grant Sylvan's access logs. Dates, times, account numbers. The night in March is in there too. Julian still didn't touch the envelope, but one small thing in his posture changed. He uncrossed his legs. "The originals are in 3 places," Nolan continued. "1 copy is in Emmett Ward's safe. 1 is at my attorney's office in Naperville. The 3rd is scheduled to be emailed to the FBI office in Chicago on South Roosevelt at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." He paused. "Only 1 person can cancel that transmission, and that person is standing here." There was no sound inside the warehouse except the generator humming in the corner. Julian Marchetti stared at the envelope for a long time. 61 years old, and he had spent 40 years learning not to fear anything pointed at him. But the thing lying on that metal table wasn't pointed at anyone at all, and that was precisely what kept him sitting still. "You go down with me," he said. "I know. You turn that over. They take everything. The port, the warehouses, all of it. You too. You lose more than I do." "I know." Nolan turned his head toward Zelda. "Stand up, sweetheart." Zelda rose. Julian's 2 men looked at him, waiting, and Julian gave them no signal at all. The small side door of the warehouse opened, and Tobias Kane stepped inside, walked straight to Zelda, and led her out. No one stopped them. When the door closed behind her, Julian Marchetti rose from the chair, and there was already a gun in his hand. He didn't raise it immediately. He simply held it down alongside his leg. "You came in here unarmed," he said. "You think I won't do it? I think you will." Nolan didn't move back. "But you're the one who has to decide in the next 30 seconds. "I don't." Julian lifted the gun to chest level. Nolan stayed exactly where he was, not even changing the position of his feet. He didn't reach for anything, didn't raise his hands, didn't step back half a pace. He only looked directly at the old man pointing a gun at his chest, and said one sentence, low and perfectly clear. "I made a promise to my wife." Julian didn't understand. "What?" "I brought 4 men with me. They've been outside for the last 15 minutes. I could have walked in here and ended this the way your father and mine would have." Nolan tilted his head slightly. "I promised my wife she would never have to see that again. So tonight I'm doing it another way." The side door opened for the 2nd time. Tobias Kane had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Julian's 2 men didn't have time to do anything, because they had been standing in the wrong places from the very beginning, and both of them realized it at the same moment. Tobias moved behind Julian, placed one hand on his wrist, and twisted downward. The gun hit the concrete with a hard, dry crack and slid about 6 feet across the floor. No one fired. No one hit anyone. Julian Marchetti sat back down in the old office chair, one arm held behind him, breathing heavily in the way of a 61-year-old man who had just realized he had miscalculated a single move in 40 years. Nolan picked up the envelope from the table and tucked it beneath his arm. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, he said. You have 8 hours to call your lawyer. He walked toward the door. Tobias kept Julian in the chair until the sound of Nolan's car had left the yard, then released him and followed. Outside, Zelda was standing beside the car. Nolan opened the door for her, and she got in without asking a single question. Neither of them spoke during the drive home, and she watched his 2 hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. They returned to Lake Forest at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. 9 people were still in the large dining room, the ones who hadn't left. Rosalind remained seated at the head of the table. Emmett Ward stood beside the window. When Nolan and Zelda walked in, all 9 of them rose at the same time, and the person seated nearest the emptiest chair pulled it out, turned it around, then stepped back to make room. No one said anything. They were all waiting for her to sit down, and every one of them believed she would. Zelda walked toward the chair. She placed one hand on its back and stood there. She remained that way long enough for the 9 people around her to begin wondering what was happening. Then she spoke, loudly enough for all 9 of them to hear, and her voice didn't tremble. Tonight I knelt on the floor of this house. I knelt right there, 4 steps from where I'm standing now. And of the 40 people sitting around this table, not one person stood up. No one answered her. 2 people lowered their eyes to the tabletop. I'm not angry with any of you. I've worked in service for 6 years. I know how people look at us. What I can't do is sit down here and eat at the same table with people who only began respecting me after they found out whose wife I am. She removed her hand from the back of the chair and stepped half a pace away. This chair doesn't belong to me. It never belonged to Miss Marchetti either. It's only a chair. Then she turned toward Nolan. He was standing about 6 feet away and hadn't spoken once since entering the room. I'm not asking you to choose between me and them, she said. I'm asking you to choose between a life and a throne. She walked toward the door. She didn't hurry. She passed the 9 people still standing, past the long table, past the place where she had entered earlier that evening carrying a serving tray, and before she reached the hallway, Nolan was already walking behind her. He didn't say a word to anyone in the room, and he didn't look back. At the head of the table, Rosalind Castellano sat down, and of the 9 people present, she was the only one smiling. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the scheduled email was sent exactly on time. Nolan didn't cancel it. 9 days later, he walked into the FBI office on South Roosevelt with his attorney and signed a cooperation agreement. He turned over all 14 years of financial records, gave testimony about the Marchetti network, and in return, he was allowed to leave the criminal world entirely, while all operations of the organization were brought to an end. Julian Marchetti and Grant Sylvan were federally indicted for money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Celeste Marchetti lost everything her father had left behind, and no one from either family ever called her again. The legitimate businesses, including the port, warehouses, and real estate holdings, were transferred into Emmett Ward's name for him to manage. Nolan kept no family assets for himself. He took only one thing with him when he left the house in Lake Forest, the gray wool scarf he had kept with him ever since that rainy night. In April of the following year, Zelda Bennett returned to nursing school to complete the 3 semesters she still had left. Rubies had replaced the shattered glass and reopened during the winter. On the nights when she studied late, a man would sit at the table in the farthest corner at 3 o'clock in the morning, order a cup of black coffee, and leave a tip exactly equal to the bill, not a penny more or less. He sat there waiting until she finished studying, then drove her home. On their hands were 2 steel rings they had bought for $80 at a shop on Halsted Street. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. A person's dignity isn't something other people can grant, and no one can take it away unless that person chooses to surrender it. The way someone treats the person serving them reveals more about who they are than everything they might show off to the world. Kindness given without asking who the other person is, without expecting anything in return, is the one thing in this world that money can never buy. And please, never confuse being tolerated with being genuinely valued, because from the outside those 2 things can look very much alike, but they lead us toward 2 completely different lives. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, have you ever met someone who treated you with kindness at a time when you had nothing in your hands? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. If today's story touched you, we hope you'll give it a like and share it with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more meaningful stories like this one. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.